morning, everyone. My name is Greg Livingstone with Lubricated, and I am the pitch moderator. So I'm subbing in for the normally scheduled moderator here to introduce our first talk here at the conference. And so I have the honor of introducing Bryan Johnson from Arizona Public Services. Bryan's served, he's had 25 years experience in predictive maintenance and lubrication engineer for the nation's largest nuclear power plant, Palo Verde, in beautiful Arizona. His primary responsibility is to evaluate and specify lubricants for plant use and perform predictive maintenance, condition monitoring duties related to lube testing and data evaluation. He's also runs the station's lubrication program, lube storage, cleanliness requirements, usage documentation, root cause determination, and he's spent 6 years as a maintenance engineer at a naval training facility in upstate New York. He's a certified lubrication grease specialist by NLGI, holds a master's degree in mechanical engineering, and chairman of the International Council for Machinery Lubrication, ICML. And he's also the current chairman of ASTM DO2 CS96 for basically the body of ASTM that develops standards and guides for monitoring in-service lubricants. And he's also been awarded the fellow status by ASTM for his contribution. So Bryan is he's the big man on campus, so I have the honor to present, to introduce him here, and he has a talk on understanding the new asset management standard for lubricated machinery. Please join me in welcoming Bryan.
Greg, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I have had the pleasure to be in the industry for a long time and have seen the industry actually develop, which is kind of a neat thing. When I first came into the industry, there was not something like this wonderful conference that we're all able to participate with. The best I could do was a telephone call to a tech service hotline and to try to glean any information possible because there just wasn't information available. So I commend all of you for taking an active interest in bettering yourself in a knowledge area, and that's really what we're doing here. We're going to talk about asset management and a new standard that ICML is put out there. And to give you kind of a sense of what this is, you can see the booklet off in the corner. But basically, asset management is a topic that has been discussed extensively, I believe, in industry for many years under various different forms. The total quality management might be one form, reliability-centered maintenance might be another form. There are various acronyms that have been developed over the years that kind of go into the same area, but not in the same area for lubrication. And I would suggest to everyone in this room that without lubrication, it doesn't work at all. So let me try to make a case for why asset management is important. You know, the obvious one is that we do this because we want to make our business more effective and efficient, and we do this because we want to show a return in value for our efforts. And I believe in terms of a maintenance organization, the reliability piece, the piece that we're all involved with, is perhaps the only piece that is not a cost center. It's a savings generator. So when we're successful, the plant becomes more successful. I think that's kind of how we think of ourselves. I'm going to suggest maybe another avenue that is another way to look at this. As I believe everyone is aware, we have some very significant global issues going on right now, and I'll talk to an environmental one, which would be the climate change that we read so much about, the storms, all the damage that's causing. We've talked about the value of friction reduction in our industry, and we've talked about that in terms of cost reduction, but I don't know that we've ever really talked about it in terms of something that's going to matter to our children and our grandchildren. And that would be if we are successful at reducing costs, successful at leveraging the value of our lubrication assets, we in this room have the opportunity to lower the pollution levels, lower the CO2 levels globally. You know, you think in terms of a 2 or 3% gain in efficiency, and we know we do this in cars. Been a lot of money spent over the years to have a mile per gallon increase in cars. And the oil we put into our cars is a big piece of that. But we leverage that same thought across all of industry, and what's the value in it? 1%, 2%, 3%? Can you imagine we, as an industry, if we focused on that 1 or 2 or 3%, it's an easy get, and it's a huge get in terms of all the pollution that's out there. So I would suggest we also think in terms of our environmental benefit in managing our asset better, and I would also suggest that the lubrication piece is a vital, significant piece of asset management, and we're going to talk about how we do that. I guess before I go on, I've had this slide up here in the front. So some key questions, I'm not going to try to answer them right now. I hope in the course of the next half an hour, we can frame these within the presentation so they have maybe a different meaning than where you'd start with. But just general questions. How is good defined? What does good mean? Do we know? We each have our own paradigm of what we think good is, but what is it? How about best practices? Is there anyone here that doesn't feel like they have best practices within their facility? Do we dare raise our hands? Okay, so what does it mean? What is the best practice? How do we define it? How do we describe it? How do we bin it? What do we do with it? And then I'm going to suggest also is rather than good and best practices, should our goal really be best possible? Okay, that's also kind of vague. What does best possible mean? Well, hopefully we'll get a little more clarity on that over the next few minutes. Okay, so key terms. We're talking asset management, and this is a global topic. So what is asset management? So the first thing we think of is the asset is the pump, the valve, the motor, the gearbox. That's our asset. Is that really the only industrial asset that's of importance to have a successful asset management program? ICML would say no. Okay, so an asset could be inanimate, it could be a pump, but how about a person? I would offer that everyone in this room is an asset of your organization. You're either a very strong, positive asset, or you're an emerging asset. I don't think we have a bad asset in the group. Financial, tangible. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of what an asset is, the next piece of that is asset management. The reality of the world is that we need a balance. We cannot have a goal of absolute utopia in everything we do because we can't afford it. There's a risk and a cost associated with all that, so management talks to that. The balancing of cost, risk, and benefit, but how do we do that? And so this is a piece of asset management that I don't believe we consider to the point we should. So the final item on this is asset management system. So it's easy to say what the assets are. It's maybe easy to say that asset management is risk and benefit and all that sort of thing, but how do you put that into a process so it has sustainability? That's part of our challenge. We'll look at this in terms of how bad it can be. So go ahead and look at these lists and see if any of you see any of these elements in your own work environment. Take a look at it. Do you ever see a flavor of the month initiative? Have you ever been someone who's offered that that's the way our business runs? We're based on tribal knowledge. How many of you have sat in a meeting where you're trying to discuss a problem and you have a fairly careful but controlled discussion, and the discussion goes on and you're starting to build towards something until the boss on the end of the table says, yeah, this is what I think we need to do, and it stops. Okay? Well, what does that do for us? So the impact on the organization of all these things is bad. We wind up working at a lower threshold, a lower standard than we would if we had a better process that we could work to versus working to personalities and what's worked well last time, trial and error, those kind of things. We want to move away from that. This slide kind of frames asset management with various important pieces, and there are several of them. and I don't have time to try to explore each of them, so I'm going to talk about the safety one. This, I think, has a high value. I believe personal safety is something we can't compromise, and I believe organizations that put an anchor into the rock, not just the sand, say we're not going to hurt people. There's a very high value of that, but in managing assets carefully, we have a better chance to be successful in that area, not hurting somebody. We don't want to send somebody home different than we received them. Parts of that would be if we manage our risk carefully, which safety is part of, we're going to have less business intrusion into our processes. Things are going to work better. And we have better planning and control because of that. So anyway, there are other elements here. I believe the slides are available. You want to take a look at them, explore it further, they'd be available for you to do so. Standards that define excellence. Is everyone familiar with the ISO 9000, ISO 9001? Have you heard about that? Did you know about that many years ago? You know, maybe, maybe not. But this term has become synonymous with an element of how we manage our businesses. I'm going to offer that ISO 55000 is going to do the same thing to asset management. And this product that ICML has developed is a way of how we do that within the lubrication world. So the 55000 is more encompassing than lubrication, but we're very carefully defining what we do within our own realm. And that part of our process that we can control. A little bit of background into the ISO 55000. The British had an asset management standard past 55. It's now been canceled. That was a forerunner to help develop what the ISO 55000 is. So there is precedence. There's a process that has been developed, that has been vetted, that's worked, that's been moved into an international standard, this 55000. So what does this mean for us today? Well, you can see this very clever graphic. And what I would suggest is that we do have the first part of this done. Part 1, ICML 55.1, you can get a copy of it. And what this is a list of requirements and elements that make a program successful. And it is all encompassing. It's more than just the lubricant, because you can't have a successful lubrication program without other pieces. The other two, 55.2 would be how to implement it. The 55.3, when that comes out, is going to be how we audit ourselves, how we decide how well we're doing against the standards. Are we successful? Where can we find improvements? So that would be a third party's look at our process to help us get better. The ICML 55, it was broken down into 12 key areas that are related to lubrication. And some of these, you might look at it and you might say, you know, is this really lubrication? I'm going to say yes. Troubleshooting, if we troubleshoot equipment that's lubricated, is that related to lubrication? I would suggest yes. We can make a lot of errors in the lubricant we specify. Skills, job tasks, training, and competency. Everyone in attendance in this meeting benefits by knowledge transfer, knowledge gaining, training, opportunities like this. Very, very positive. So anyway, these 12 items would be wheels on the spoke, so to speak. So I'm going to kind of dive in on one of the 12 to explore it a little bit more deeply, to kind of give you a sense of how these things are organized. And each of the 12 would have a similar pattern. So in this case, we'll look at lubrication management. And this is something that we commonly do. I think this is intuitive to most organizations. It would have a piece of how do we decide what we place into equipment? And how do we decide when we bring it in that it's really what we ordered? How long do we keep it? How do we store it? We place it in machinery. How long do we leave it there? And then when it ends its life cycle, what do we do with it? So one element of the ICML 55.1 would be to do all that for lubrication management. So it's a life cycle approach. And really, all of these 12 elements would also have a life cycle type element associated with them. Let's go back to our earlier questions. How is good defined? So how would you define good for lubrication management programs? Anyone dare offer a thought on that? Yes?
If good is supposed to be less than best practice, then good in your organization could be that you just get the oil in and you just assume that new oil is clean oil and you pour it into the machine, that's it. That may be good in your, but it's not best practice, but it may be good because that's all we know.
And so what does best practice mean? Do you have an idea on that? I'll point this way, so anyone that dares... Yeah, do you have some thoughts on what you think best practice is?
Yeah, I mean, using, filtered oil, clean oil going into machines that are properly labeled, what should be going in it. The machine's modified with, your sight glasses, your breathers, just the whole gambit of tools that we know about.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So the next question, and I think I'll pick on you for this one. Are the concepts of good and best practices as they were described, are they sustainable the way they described them? Would you be able to maintain best practices using the criteria he gave?
Yes, supposed to be something that's better, something that's better than us. We can say it as a best practice.
Yeah, and I think that is mainly true. I think our challenge with that is that those terms are so generic in nature that they move. And they're so generic in nature that different people think they mean different things. So what you consider to be best practice might not be what your boss's boss's boss thinks best practice is, because that gentleman might think best practice is lowest possible cost. See, so some of these things I think have a risk. It's, these terms have risks. So let me throw out best possible. So best possible also brings in the concept of risk and benefit, not just the goodness of what we do, but how does it balance? So you think in terms of that, and we're talking about elements of this that can help us be successful. Yes?
You're not reinventing the wheel. These are standards that are working in the industry, right? You're not trying to do that.
No,
You're trying
right.
to follow best practices for me, I guess, is what's actually happening in the industry.
Right.
In general, everybody's following. If I follow this to the letter, then I could be heading towards best practices, right?
Yeah, and I would suggest that because what best practices are has never been compiled for the lubrication industry, it's very hard to know what it is we're working toward. Now, we can come to a meeting like this and hear the best talk we've ever heard, and we know it's true, we take it back to our plant, and can we convey that to the boss's boss's boss? Probably not. Now, how can we anchor that? So there needs to be an extra piece, but I think you're on the right track with it. Okay, so some attributes of these 12 things. I talked about the one, I kind of dove in a little bit. Job, task, skills, training, and competency. Wes mentioned the certifications that ICML will be offering. That would be one obvious way to demonstrate that there's competency and the training in the process, certifications that can be tracked and whatnot. That would be an important piece. Are people an asset that will produce at a known level? Does management have that confidence? Do we have some way to demonstrate some level of capability? Machine lubrication and condition monitoring. We all have probably oil monitoring programs. But what is that? There are pluses and minuses. Is the testing good? Is the data quality? What is the variation in data? What does the data mean for a small volume versus a big volume? There are lots of opportunities to make that better as well. The right test.
Right package.
Right, and how many of us have purchased a test that may not have a strong value for what we're monitoring because that's the standard package the lab offers. I don't know that that's as bad as it is now today,
No.
but 25 years ago I would suggest that everybody offered exactly the same packages for all machinery. Yes?
It's quite often I experience that people have this package, standard package, and then they say, and then I put on these best practices, but I cannot see that they actually improve something.
Right.
And that's because they didn't measure it.
Yeah, and I can share a story with that. I've been working at the plant for many, many years, and And there were people that from time to time have thought we've done a good job. So in my industry, if somebody is noted as doing a good job, other people come to visit. So we had a group come in, it was somebody that represented 7 coal power plants in the Midwest. And I wanted to see what we were doing, so I'm chatting with the guy. So I asked him, I said, well, your program, what are some of your big successes? And all of us would tend to go to the biggest save we've ever had. That would be the first thing we'd say, which, excuse me, which I would suggest doesn't necessarily mean we have a good program. It means that we got at least one right. But when I asked this gentleman, what's your success? And he says, well, you know, really, they're talking about canceling us. Well, what do you do? And he gave me this big, long list of testing they've done on machinery, a big population of samples they've done. Well, why would you cancel that? It sounds like you have a good basis for a successful program. So what does he say? He says, well, because we have never identified an adverse condition. Can you imagine a fleet of 7 coal power plants with an active condition monitoring program that is not able to find at least one nugget in several years? You know, something's wrong. There are missing elements in their program, their asset management process that need to be plugged, that should have been plugged. I don't know if they were from the hour or so he spent with us, but it was a start. Okay, some of the other items, lubrication support facilities, all of us have a lube room of some sort. And some of us may have had the experience of our lube room starting out with a fenced-in area, the side of a building with a drum standing in the area, and rain in the top of the bung of the 55-gallon drums. Has anyone ever seen that anywhere? Hopefully not at your plant for very long, but it's a reality. That's a piece of our asset management that is so incredibly important. You think about the millions and millions of dollars of assets that drum of oil is protecting, and we think so little of it that we allow an inch of water to sit on the top of it. Don't even think about it. It's just oil. And you've heard that. I'm sure you've heard that within your organizations. 4 more. So I'm not really spending a lot of time on each because I don't have a lot of time to spend on each. Energy conservation and environmental impact. I did mention that. As we become more successful, as we help machines last longer, as we reduce wear rates, as we select the lubricant that is able to stay in service longer and provide good protection, as we select the lubricant that is able to reduce the energy requirement of the machine, each of those elements have a direct impact on the environment. And our industry has a tremendous opportunity to leverage that for the good of the world. Isn't that kind of a neat thing to say? That we in our industry have a significant opportunity to make the world better, and we do. Every day we go to work, we do. Okay, so, but, there's always the big but. There have been many, many good programs that have developed over the years that have had a very strong champion. And you know what I mean by champion. You get that guy that everybody knows on site. And he runs a good program, and he helps the facility. And then what happens when the boss's boss gets promoted? And a new boss's boss shows up and wants to know what you're doing for me today. You know, the program is successful. We're not failing as much equipment. We run, our baseline of how we're operating has been reduced, but the new guy coming in doesn't know that. So what's his first reaction? His or her first reaction, I'm sorry ladies, would be what? To scale the program back. Why are we spending money on this? This looks like a big cost drain to our budget. What are you doing for me? So that piece, that very success can be very limiting to us. So I would suggest that the 12th element of the 12 elements within ICML 55.1, talking to program management metrics, could in many ways be the most important element. And it's one that we don't necessarily think about. We complain about it. You know, so-and-so won't let me come to training anymore because of budget. Has anyone ever thought that in the past? Now, maybe nobody in this room because you were able to convince the boss to let you come. No, so maybe a little bit different environment with these people, but I think that would be a common thing we'd hear in industry. So what this is, and I'm going to go back to the best possible argument, this 12th area. And really what this is to have a process within the management system that is able to produce continuous improvement. So less important that every element of the 12 elements in your program is strong and successful. More important that you've evaluated your program and you've gone piece by piece, area by area, and determined what you have, what your program is doing, and then use what you found out and again, very self-critically or by bringing somebody in, decide what the very best level could be for each of those 12 areas. What would the best trained maintenance technician look like? If you had your way, and I'm going to kind of pick on you a little bit, what would the premium lubrication technician look like in the industry? Can you describe him? Other than yourself, of course?
Well, myself. I want to see someone who understood lubricants a little bit, understood what was available and where they should best be used. I want to see someone who understood that the same lubricant isn't necessarily going to work for one machine as it does for another. And I want to see someone who knows better than the mixed lubricants.
So what I kind of heard is that you would want that person to have several key elements or attributes in their capability. And you've described several of them. You want knowledge, you want recognition, you want somebody that is intuitive, somebody that can follow a process.
Yeah.
To me, I don't want the guy out in the field to be that guy that is willing to guess 20% of the time. Do you want the guesser out there working on your equipment? No. So that's a piece of it. So think, anyone else want to add to what the ideal maintenance technician would look like? You got some thoughts? Yeah, you in the cool hat. I like wearing hats, so I'm going to pick on you.
He just needs to be knowledgeable, intuitive, follow the program, know what's going on.
So you want somebody that knows what they're doing.
Yes.
And somebody willing to follow the process, right?
Right.
You don't want the free spirit out there again.
No.
And we all know that those guys are out there.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes they save our bacon, but sometimes they cause an issue that we have to recover from 6 or 9 months later, because lubrication is an unusual field in that our decisions have latent consequences. And have you thought about that with what you do? The term latent consequence? I can put an oil into a machine that is the wrong oil, that allows those precious surfaces, that engineering surface that we're trying to protect, to touch. The other oil that I've always put in there doesn't allow that. This one does. So what happens? Well, I degrade the surface finish. When I degrade the surface finish, I create wear particles. The wear particles accelerate the degradation of the machine, and we have a failure 6 or 12 months later. Now, it isn't obvious that the reason we had that failure was because I allowed the wrong oil in. You kind of get what I'm driving at a little bit here? Very, very important points. So anyway, we need to have a plan in place. We need to have a process, and the ICML 55.1 is a process with requirements in the 12 areas that one could follow to decide how they're doing, and then one could use to establish what good looks like. And then that delta needs to be based upon risk and benefit. And how do we know if we're doing well, what good looks like, what best practice looks like? Well, we have self-assessments. We have metrics, we have reports, and we have a management team that is on board enough that they will respond to what our reports tell us to do. Wouldn't that be a great place to be?
I could add something.
Yes.
I'm working with the guys that I have in my firm, and I know they have the knowledge, they have the skills, they know how to follow a process, but they don't have a vision of where we're trying to get with this program. That for me is a problem.
It is.
Because people with no vision, they will understand they know how to do the process, they don't follow it, they know why we're actually doing it, what we're trying to do. So for me, if I'm trying to look for somebody in one of my good guys or one of my other guys, I want them to have that vision and go to that. We might never reach the world class lubrication program, but we at least have realistic objectives, a vision to actually get there. So,
And I would suggest that perfect. I mean, you're a setup guy, and I didn't pay him, everybody. Okay, so I would suggest that that you mention the word process, you mention the word vision. If one were to use a process, a 12-element process, and the ICML 55 is patterned after ISO 55000. You know, so it would fit nicely within that envelope. So it would be, by extension, using ISO 55000 principles in our lubrication area. But that process will help define what good looks like. Now you mentioned the word world-class. Now, I would suggest that if you have the 12 elements covered in your program, and very importantly, the continuous improvement piece, that you will find world-class works for you. And your version of world-class is not going to be the same as your version of world-class, because your resources, your plant priorities, your capital available, the importance of machinery is going to be different. So it's almost naive to set up on a pedestal what world-class looks like. Because really each practitioner that follows the process carefully can decide what world-class is, and through continuous improvement, through metrics, you have a metric in there saying that we don't want to change oil until it's time to change the oil. So when we change the oil, we test it. How do we do? Well, the oil is on its last gasp. We're going too far. We're setting up latent conditions 6 to 9 months out. We're reducing the life of equipment. The other alternative is we're changing oil out to the vendor tech manual, and they say every 3 months put new oil in. Well, that's really a 5-year oil in that application. You know, so you find that out based upon your conditions. Your continuous improvement process, your testing, your measurement, your feedback can help you decide on how long do we leave the oil in equipment. You can find that best place for you. And in some equipment, it might be that you, rather than doing all this testing, because testing has a cost, that you leverage your knowledge elsewhere and you say, for this class of equipment, we're going to replace the oil every 4 years, because it makes economic sense for us. And that's what this whole process is. Some way for we as an industry to follow a roadmap, so to speak, in the 12 key areas that we have to determine what our programs are. That's the first step. We got to be critical enough to say, you know, we're really pretty weak in these 3 areas and they're hurting us. And then through the continuous improvement process, bring those 3 areas up. And naturally, if all these pieces are in place, we're going to find an optimal, as indicated, some kind of an optimal state, some kind of a best practice plateau. We're going to find that because the system will help us bring there. And that's where it's important to have a systematic type approach to something like this. Okay, so a little bit more on the continuous improvement. Start with a high-level concept, move to applying a process, focus on site implementation. You'll go put your process in the field. Finally, check and adjust. So once your process is in place, does it work? And what do we need to do to meet our original goal, or is our original goal the wrong goal? We really are putting way too much effort into this area because it's not cost effective for us. And that's robbing these 2 or 3 areas from being better. You know, those are the kind of decisions we need to be able to make. So finally, I've listed the 12 areas again. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this discussion with me. I think it's been very engaging. I really appreciate the level of exchange that we've had together. So I'd like to open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes. The zoning that has been certified by 55,000, is it also compliant? That means we can say that
Yeah.
it will comply to ICML 55.
Yeah. Yes. So when we get this completely done, it is going to be ISO 55000 compliant. Yes. And that is a big deal in part of the world right now. It's going to be a big deal in all of the world, just like ISO 9000 was. You know, that came out, it was a stress and people rushed to do it. It helped everybody, but there was a stressful time. So this is being one step ahead for an area that really, really matters to the industrial community. How do we get the most out of our assets? And I'm not just talking about the pump. I'm talking about all of you. How do we set up sustainability in knowledge transfer? That would be an element of it. No, so what happens in 6 months from now, and I'm not suggesting that you look like you're 60, but in 6 months, you win the lottery and you take home 25 million big ones, whatever that means to you, and you don't want to work anymore, so you retire. So what happens to your facility when you go? And that happens over a weekend. You win the big money. Does your organization suffer a significant step backwards in that aspect of asset management because they no longer have anyone on site that has any clue about what they're doing? They can't tell the difference between a brown oil and a yellow oil except for the color. And does it even matter if it's brown or yellow? I have no idea about that. So do you kind of get the drift of that? Each of these elements are vulnerable if we don't have a process and program in place to make them not vulnerable. So good point. Any other questions?
Well, just a comment.
Yes.
I'm owner of the company doing the lubrication services, outsourcing.
Yes.
We are managing like 15 power plants, refineries in Europe, and basically we are following all of these 12 issues pretty well, I think. We are businessly successful, but I'm thinking now how to implement the schedule rules in the whole process. Because in Europe we are pretty used to ISOs. 9,000, 14,000, 18,000, a lot of these programs, we understand it, but I'm now thinking how this scheduling will impact our business, because it's a lot of work to make it so scheduled like the standard says.
I'm not sure it's as scheduled and structured as you think, because a big, there are a whole bunch of elements that need to be considered, but the way this process works is it requires a self-assessment. You start out by saying, what is it that we do? And then once you have that description against what you could or should be doing, then determine a gap between what the best would look like, where you could ideally get to if you had all the resources in the world. And that gap is what the continuous improvement process will help define. So I would suggest that a service provider, this would be an opportunity to help your customers and industries get better as they critically look at what they're doing and then strive to improve their process. And you as an outside source with a high level of knowledge can come in and help them better define those gaps and help them with a plan. Because I'd also suggest that part of this is that we need to have sustainability, and we are not going to have sustainability in many of these areas if we don't have a process in place that includes that management metrics and review thing. And I would think that you'd be a big part of that. Does that help? Okay. All right, so it looks like time is up because our moderator stood up and...
Nice job, Bryan.